Good evening and welcome to the second season of Literature Berks. My name is Amanda Hornberger. I'm the program director at the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks and the co-chair of Literature Berks. And on behalf of our entire Literature Berks committee, I'm thrilled to welcome you to this series of programs. Literature Berks is a community-wide celebration of books and authors presented by the Jewish Federation of Reading Berks in partnership with the Exeter Community Library and Sinking Spring Public Library and the Jewish Book Council. In the chat, you will see a link to purchase a signed copy of Citizen 865, The Hunt for Hitler's Hidden Soldiers in America. Right here, you can see the book through our official book vendor, Reads and Company Bookshop. Literature Berks is happy to support a local independent bookstore, and we encourage you to continue to shop local during this time. Remember that books always make great gifts. Throughout the webinar, feel free to type any questions you may have into the Q&A function. We will do our best to answer questions throughout the program. Debbie Cenziper is an investigative journalist, professor, and author based in Washington, D.C. She's a contributing reporter for the investigative team at the Washington Post. She has won many major awards in print journalism, including the 2007 Pulitzer Prize for local reporting for her year-long investigation of housing corruption in Miami, which led to the convictions of several developers and to a federal takeover of the county housing agency. In 2006, Debbie was named a Pulitzer finalist in exemplary reporting for her series exposing breakdowns in the nation's hurricane warning system. She's the co-author of the critically acclaimed Love Wins, The Lovers and Lawyers Who Fought the Landmark Case for Marriage Equality. She was recently named the Director of Investigative Journalism at Northwestern University Medill School of Journalism. I'm honored to welcome Debbie Cenziper to Literature Berks.
Thank you. Thanks, Amanda. And I guess I would say welcome, and I am so thrilled that you all decided to take time out from this crazy day and crazy week. Maybe it is a good distraction to hear about books and especially a book like this, which I hope if you read you'll feel good about and inspired and happy about when you're done. But thank you for joining me. And I'm also really happy to be here. I grew up in Philadelphia and my family is still there. So it's always nice to speak to an audience from Pennsylvania. So I thought I would talk to you a little bit about Citizen 865. This book got started in the final moments of 2016, quite literally at a New Year's Eve party a few minutes before midnight. I fell into a conversation with the lawyer from the Department of Justice here in Washington, D.C. And over the course of this conversation, she started telling me about a little known unit deep inside the Justice Department that had spent the better part of 30 years hunting for Nazi war criminals who had slipped into the United States in the years after the war and were essentially hiding in plain sight in American cities and suburbs. And I remember leaving the party that night with two lingering questions. One was, how was it possible that we were still finding Nazi war criminals and collaborators on US soil so many decades after the end of World War II? I just found that thought both astounding and depressing. I was also really wanting to know more about the people inside this Nazi hunting unit, the prosecutors and the historians who had spent years hunting for Nazi war criminals. What was it like for them day after day and week after week to probe some of the darkest moments in recent history, to interview not only Holocaust survivors and witnesses, but also mass murderers who describe mass murder in such clinical, chilling terms. I really wanted to get to know the people doing this work. I've been an investigative reporter for more than 20 some years. I worked at the Miami Herald. I spent a decade on staff at the Washington Post. And you can imagine in Miami and Washington, there's no shortage of great investigative stories. And I really turned to nonfiction writing, both in this book and in my last book, because I wanted to write about people who were doing good things, not just agencies and people and institutions who were not. And I always look for characters and stories that move and inspire me as a journalist, as a wife, as a mom. And the people in this book, the prosecutors and historians that you will get to know if you read Citizen 865, they were really trying to do the right thing and at great personal cost. And so that's what led me down this journey to want to tell this story. And so after that New Year's Eve party, I called one of the historians. Her name is Elizabeth Barry White, and now she works at the Holocaust Museum here in DC. But she had spent many years inside the unit, this Nazi hunting unit known as the Office of Special Investigations. She started telling me about a trip that she took with a few other historians in 1990. They went to Prague to search the archives for Nazi rosters and records that had been hidden in the archives of that city, either by the Germans or by the Soviets, in the months leading up to the end of the war, and then in the months right after the end of World War II. And this was a huge turn of events for Western historians because when they had asked to get into the archives in cities like Moscow and Kiev and Prague, they were often turned down by the communist governments in Eastern Europe. And so Western historians couldn't really get in to mine the Nazi rosters and records that they knew existed and fill in the gaps of this horrific time during this war. And so, as we all know, in the late 1980s, communism collapsed, and suddenly historians from this unit were invited to go to Prague to search Nazi records that had never been searched by Western historians. And so Elizabeth White and her colleague Peter Black fly into Germany, rent this old stick shift and chug their way across the country, arrive in Prague in the middle of the night, show up in to their rented apartment, and there was a Soviet woman who was the caretaker. And she took one look at Elizabeth White, who was 3 months pregnant and suffering from morning sickness, and still insisted that poor Elizabeth White eat beer and pork cutlets for breakfast. Elizabeth was not interested in that at all, but she powered through it as women do. And one morning, a government sedan pulled up, and armed Czech security agents invited them into the car. And so Elizabeth and Peter were taken to a big government complex, and there they were introduced to a whole bunch of government agents lining this big room with an oriental carpet and guns in their holsters. And through an interpreter, Peter Black said, "My name is Peter Black. This is Barry White, and we're here representing the United States Department of Justice." And of course, all of the armed Czech security agents started snickering because they're thinking, Peter Black, Barry White, does the CIA have any imagination? Could they not come up with the better names, code names, than Peter Black and Barry White? And so they thought they were spies. But of course they weren't spies, they were historians. And so they were shown into the archives in the basement. And Barry White, who was pregnant, would every hour on the hour rush into the bathroom, which was in an air shaft with a chain that flushed the toilet, and get sick and then come back and go back through more records. And several hours into this, she pushed back the chair and she ran over to Peter and she said, "I think I found something." And what Barry White found in 1990 in the dusty archives of Prague was a roster from 1945 that listed the names of 700 men who had served in an obscure Nazi training camp in occupied Poland, in a tiny farming village known as Travniki. And they knew of Travniki. There were records and mentions of Travniki in some scholarly journals. They knew it was a Nazi training camp. They knew that the men who were trained in Travniki had helped liquidate the Jewish ghettos of occupied Poland and helped guard the perimeters of the death camps in Poland, occupied Poland. They really didn't know much more than that. But what they knew in looking at that roster from their prior investigative work is that several of the men listed as Travniki soldiers were in fact living here in the United States. And that find in Prague in 1990 led this Nazi hunting unit inside the Justice Department on a 15-year investigation into the men of the Travniki training camp. And so, if I may, I'd love to talk to you just a little bit about the history of Travniki, if I can figure out how to use my PowerPoint. Hold on one second. Hold on. Let me exit full screen. Here we go. So Travniki really is, and still is to this day, a small farming village south of Warsaw. And Travniki was a strategic location for the Third Reich because it connected. It was a hub for the railway stations, and so it had rail lines that connected Travniki to all the major Jewish hubs in occupied Poland. And so what happened was, in the early months of the war, the Germans realized that to annihilate the Jews of occupied Poland, they needed manpower. They needed boots on the ground because German soldiers were busy fighting on the Soviet front. And so the leaders of the SS and the Third Reich in occupied Poland started recruiting civilians from Poland, from Latvia, from Lithuania. And they also recruited Soviet soldiers who had been captured, sent to POW camps where they faced certain death, and they plucked them out of the POW camps, put them in Travniki, and actually trained them. They really recruited among enemy ranks. And over time, they found 5,000 men to serve in Travniki. They were not members of the SS. In many cases, in most cases, they were not even ethnic Germans. But they came to Travniki for all kinds of reasons. They were fed, they were given barracks, lodging, health insurance, they were given vacation time and pay, their bellies were full during the war. And so in Travniki, this training camp, they were armed, they were dressed in uniforms. There were reports that these men were made to, quote, shoot a Jew to prove their loyalty to the Nazi cause. But over time, the SS developed a very loyal killing force in what became, in every sense, a school for mass murder in this town. And so in March of 1942, the Travniki men were deployed on their first assignment in occupied Poland to the Jewish town, to the town of Lublin. Lublin had 40,000 Jews before the war. It was really a vital Jewish hub in occupied Poland, a religious and cultural Jewish hub with 40,000 Jews. They were put into the Lublin ghetto, and you know, I went to visit Lublin. This picture always stops me. I went to visit Lublin to do the reporting for the story, and you know, the boundaries of the ghetto were just the outside, were just buildings. And outside the ghetto, just outside the ghetto, every weekend there was a teeming farmers market where Polish farmers brought bread and vegetables and meats. And I remember standing on the cobblestone steps of this ghetto wondering what it must have been like for parents to know that their children were hungry, and just outside their reach, well, you know, was this farmers market. And I'm always just, that idea is just astounding to me. But there were 40,000 Jews living in the ghetto when the Travniki men showed up one night. They surrounded the perimeter of the ghetto. They lighted the street lamps. They called everybody outside. They shot the old and the weak on the spot. And then they announced that 1,500 Jews a day would be deported and, quote, resettled in the East, which we now know is Nazi code for murder, because in fact, the Jews of Lublin, like so many other Jews in Poland, were taken straight to the death camps of occupied Poland, Treblinka, Sobibor, Belzec. You know, there is a difference between a concentration camp and a death camp. At a concentration camp, which, you know, is every bit as horrific, Jews were allowed to live for a little while in many cases and work as forced laborers. There were barracks. But in the death camps, they were built just for death. Jews were taken by train, immediately taken to undress, turn over their valuables, and sent to the gas chambers. And that was the fate of the Jews in Lublin. They were deported by the Travniki men. The Travniki men worked side by side with the SS to round up the Jews. In fact, many Jews at the time said the men of Travniki, although they didn't know who they were, they often called them the Ukrainians because they often had a Ukrainian accent, were more vicious than the SS. They were just very, in many cases, bloodthirsty and brutal. The men of Travniki went to the Jewish orphanage. They killed the women, the children, as well as their caregivers. They went to the Jewish hospital. They killed the patients along with the doctors and nurses. They participated in shooting operations in the woods. And on this first mission and on subsequent missions, they were so successful in helping to liquidate the Jewish ghettos of occupied Poland and to man the death camps and operate the gas chambers that Himmler himself visited the Travniki training camp several times to praise the men, to praise the camp leadership. You know, mass murder is, as we all can imagine, can take a toll on the murderers as well. And the Nazi regime did not want young German boys to go through that day after day. And that's where the men of Travniki came in. They were loyal foot soldiers. They did the dirtiest jobs in occupied Poland. And without the men of Travniki, there is no way the SS could have killed 1.7 million Jews in fewer than 20 months. Mind-boggling number. But that's how critical the men of Travniki were to the SS operation in Poland. In fact, the men of Travniki went to the Warsaw Ghetto, fought side by side with the Germans to suppress the Jewish uprising. Again, they were fighters and they were killers, and here they are standing over the bodies of the dead in the Warsaw Ghetto. The men really worked throughout the duration of the war to really help the SS do the dirtiest, bloodiest jobs in occupied Poland. Here they are at one of the death camps, and you can see this young Travniki man playing the mandolin while people were murdered not too far away. And so in Lublin, that very first city, there was a young woman who you can see here, Lucinia, or Lucy for short, and her younger brother David. And during that roundup, Lucinia and her brother David and a family friend who had a son a few years older, his name was Felix, managed to hide from the from the Travniki men in a double door, kind of like a hiding place inside the wall that Felix's father had set up. He was an architect. And so Lucy and Felix and David, though they watched their parents and siblings get taken away, they were able to escape. So they went to the Warsaw Ghetto. And where do you go in the Warsaw Ghetto when you're two Jews on the run from Nazis? They ended up going inside the ghetto because Lucy had an uncle there. And hold on, let me figure out how to get this share off here. Here we go. Oh. Hold on. Oh, I don't know how to get rid of the share. I don't know why I'm not doing that right. Oh, here we go. Sorry. And so in they went to the Warsaw Ghetto, and they were just two teenagers on the run from the Nazis. And Lucy had an uncle in the ghetto, and the uncle said, if you're going to be together, even though you're just friends, I really want you to get married. And so under the cover of night, Lucy and Felix married in the ghetto. In fact, she was only 16, didn't know what to do. She married her friend Felix, and this woman came up to Lucy in the ghetto and pulled the wedding ring off of her own finger, pressed it into Lucy's hands, and said, you take it, maybe it'll bring you better luck. And so right before the ghetto uprising, Lucy, Felix, and Lucy's younger brother David escaped with the help of the Polish underground. And it was a decision that likely saved their lives because, as we know, so many Jewish resistors overwhelming majority were ultimately killed. And so they ended up, and you can read the book to find out more, ending the war in this little village near Krakow, hiding their identities. Felix became a teacher for children in this little ghetto, taught arithmetic to Polish children. And one day at the end of the war, he heard the rumbling of Soviet tank engines, which meant liberation. And the next day, a Soviet commander walked into the village, and he said to Felix, "Who are you?" And Felix had lost everything: his mother, his father, his sister, his grandparents, everybody he knew died. And he looked at the Soviet commander, hungry, exhausted, scared, cold. And for the first time since the start of the war, Felix said, "I'm the teacher here, but I'm also a Jew." And the commander said, "You can't be a Jew. All the Jews are dead." Felix said, "No, I'm a Jew." So the commander brings over this Soviet soldier who happened to be Jewish. And he said, "You're a Jew." He says he's a Jew. Speak Yiddish to each other. And poor Felix grew up in a very assimilated Polish family and did not speak a word of English. In fact, Yiddish. In fact, when his father brought the rabbi over to their house when he was a little boy to teach Felix some lessons, when the rabbi nodded off, Felix would skip through the pages of his prayer book, so that when the rabbi woke up, he would say, "Look, Rabbi, I finished my lessons. I'm a good boy." He didn't know a word of it. But standing there at the end of the war, somehow from the depths of his soul, he remembered the Shema, the holiest prayer in the Jewish religion. And so he recited it to this young soldier, and the soldier hugged him and said, "You really are a Jew." And that's how Felix and Lucy ended the war. They ended up walking back to Lublin through freezing weather to see if anyone had survived: mother, father, grandparent, neighbor, classmate, aunt, uncle, cousin. There were 40,000 Jews in Lublin before the war. Fewer than 200 survived. Lucy and Felix were among them. And so they ended up going to Vienna, where Felix was able to earn his medical degree. And then Lucy had a distant cousin in New York who sent for them. And so in the early 1950s, Lucy and Felix got a visa to come to the United States, came over on a ship, and ended up moving into New York City and making their way from there. What they didn't know at the time, but that they would learn many years later, is that some of the very same men who had killed or who had a hand in killing everyone they ever knew in Lublin, and who then followed them to Warsaw and had a hand in helping to suppress the Jewish uprising, and who scattered to all of the other Jewish communities, Jewish ghettos in occupied Poland, to help murder the Jews there. That some of those very same men had lied about their whereabouts during the war, had ditched their uniforms, and had come to the United States, settling into some of the same communities that Holocaust survivors were living in. New York City, Chicago, several of them, one of them was in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, really hiding in plain sight here. In fact, many of these men were so good at hiding their pasts that when it became time to become American citizens, they became naturalized citizens. They stood before a flag with their hand on their hearts and pledged to defend the Constitution. And because American historians and prosecutors and investigators didn't know much about the operation of Travniki, there was no way to know who these people were. There was no way. This was an unexplored piece of Holocaust history. And so that's where the Office of Special Investigation comes in. In 1979, Simon Wiesenthal got a tip that there was a housewife living in Queens, New York, who had during the war been a commandant of a concentration camp in Lublin called Majdanek. And she had actually earned the nickname of the Stomping Mare because she would brutalize children with the soles of her jackboots. And at the end of the war, she married an American GI, lied about her activities during the war, settled into Queens, New York, into this, nice life in the 50s and 60s until Simon Wiesenthal heard about it, called the US government, and they were able to remove her from US soil. But there was a congresswoman in New York named Elizabeth Holtzman who was so appalled that Nazi collaborators and war criminals were still living in the United States in the late 1970s that she called for congressional hearings and demanded that the Justice Department create a dedicated unit inside the powerful criminal division of the Justice Department to hunt for these perpetrators and to bring them to justice. Now, of course, they couldn't try them in criminal court because the Constitution does not allow for criminal trials against non-US citizens for crimes committed on foreign soil against non-US citizens. But the Office of Special Investigation could take these men to civil court and move to strip them of their citizenship, and then take these cases to immigration court and try to convince a judge to order these men deported, removed from US soil. And I remember when I started reporting this story thinking, what motivated the prosecutors to do this? Was it revenge, retribution? You know, we see these Amazon movies that kind of glorify Nazi hunting, right? What was it? And it really wasn't revenge. It was about two things. One, these men should never have been given a visa to come to the United States in the first place, a visa that was meant for a war refugee or a Holocaust survivor. It was about taking back what should never have been handed to them in the first place. It was also about, not wanting to allow murderers and collaborators to die in peace on US soil alongside Holocaust survivors and their descendants, as well as veterans, right, who had crossed an ocean to free the Jews of Europe. It was just the wrong thing to do on so many levels. And so this unit inside the Justice Department in the 1979 thought they'd be doing this work for a couple of years. After all, how many Nazi perpetrators could still be living on US soil in the 1980s? They ended up doing this work for 30 years and eventually became, in some ways, the most successful Nazi hunting operation in the war. And so the Travnicki investigation was just a small part of this. They ultimately found about 16 Travnicki men living on US soil and were able to deport some, but not all of them. And this unit faced, an incredible uphill battle to try to convince judges, a generation removed from the war, to deport, men who looked like ordinary American citizens. This is one of them. This is a man named Jacob Reimer. He is Citizen 865. 865 was his dog tag number during the war. This is what Jacob Reimer looked like when he was a Travnicki man. He was the most trusted Travnicki man found on US soil. And this is what he looked like when the Justice Department finally caught up with him. He looked like an ordinary American citizen. He really looked like someone who had never seen the inside of a courtroom. And so how do you convince American judges to go after someone like Jacob Reimer? It was not always an easy thing to do. There were also political issues. Conservative columnists like Pat Buchanan called for this unit to be shuttered over and over again. This is about revenge. Leave these old men alone. This is all in the past. And so this unit set up in an outpost of the Justice Department in DC. The Justice Department is in this beautiful, huge, grand building near the White House. But this little Nazi hunting unit was in this outpost with frayed carpet and stain drop ceilings and, mice that ran over their shoes, prosecutors as they're sitting in a conference room. And they were a very small unit. And they were up against just great odds, just trying to convince judges to deport and denaturalize and trying to get over the political hurdles at home. And then they faced huge challenges abroad because Germany and Austria often did not want to take back Nazi war criminals found on US soil. And you can't force another country to take someone back. You can only ask. And so after these perpetrators were tracked down by this unit, and after the historians and the prosecutors pieced together who they were and what they did some 50, 60, 70 years earlier, they often couldn't convince Germany and Austria to take them back. And so in the late 1980s, this young prosecutor who you see on your screen was asked to fly to Vienna because Vienna, the Austrian government, had finally agreed that they would take back Austrian-born Nazi war criminals found here in the United States. And so Michael Bernstein said goodbye to his wife and children and flew to Vienna in 1988. And to make sure the deal was signed. This was a huge, extraordinary victory for this unit. Finally, the Austrians were going to take back Austrian-born Nazi defendants. And so Michael was asked to go to sign, make sure the deal was signed, make sure the ink was dry. He was a brilliant negotiator. So he kissed his wife and children goodbye, and he flew to Vienna and got the deal done and put the document in his briefcase. And he wanted to get home to celebrate Hanukkah with his two young children, ages 4 and 7 at the time. And so he called his boss and he said, I'm going to switch flights so I can get home earlier. And Michael tragically ended up switching to Pan Am Flight 103, which was blown up over Lockerbie, Scotland by a terrorist bomb that was stuffed inside a suitcase. And so some 50 years after the end of the war, Michael Bernstein really died in the line of duty. He really died at a very young age. And to this day, Eli Rosenbaum, who was the longtime director of the unit, is perhaps, the most successful Nazi hunter in the world in by many accounts. Keeps a picture of Michael, on his bookshelf. It was a huge tragedy. And, even though Austria agreed to take back its Nazi perpetrators, Germany for so many years resisted. And Eli Rosenbaum described to me wanting to climb onto the rooftop of the Justice Department with a megaphone and shout, "Can you believe Germany won't take its Nazis back?" But the German government just resisted for many, many years. And so a number of Nazi collaborators found on US soil, including Jacob Reimer, ended up dying here. Because they died as stateless men, but this office couldn't find another country willing to take them back. And it was the most enduring frustration that this unit faced for so many years. But they were ultimately successful in denaturalizing and deporting so many Nazi war criminals and overcoming the odds, overcoming political pressure here, overcoming resistance abroad to do this work. I mean, imagine what they were doing. They were essentially building legal cases against people who had committed murder or participated in murder years and years earlier. They had to piece that together. And to do that, they needed documents, rosters, records from all over Eastern Europe. They originally relied on witness statements, but memory can be frail, right? And so ultimately the historians stepped in and put together just thousands and thousands of pages of documents that pieced together the journeys of Nazi war criminals who had come to the United States. And I remember, even as I was reporting this, just really just inspired by their work. So many of these people could have gone on to more lucrative jobs as private lawyers and other things, and they stayed taking home government wages year after year because they believed that they had they had no tolerance for intolerance. I like to say they believed that the passage of time does not excuse mass murder, and that the United States should never provide refuge to people who participate in murder, war crimes, and genocide. And they believed, perhaps a bit too optimistically, that if they could show the rest of the world that there is no tolerance for this in the United States, perhaps it would send a message, to others that this is not a place for you. Do not come to the United States. And I think to the historians too, they were able to piece together what Travniki meant. It was an unexplored piece of Holocaust history. I went to Hebrew school. I studied the Holocaust in college. I had never heard of Travniki. And I think for the historians, they were able to kind of fill in some gaps about really what went wrong in occupied Poland and how the SS was able to pull off such a horrifically successful mass murder operation, 1.7 million Jews. And I'll end very quickly, and I'm happy to take some questions, but I do want to tell you what happened. There's my day job work on the screen, but I do want to tell you what happened to Felix and Lucy. I got their story, Felix and Lucy, because I was able to listen to their oral histories. And I remember every survivor story is extraordinary. There was something about Felix and Lucy, and my husband and kids were asleep, and it was 2 o'clock in the morning, and I could not stop listening to their story. And I wanted their story to be such a crucial part of this story. And so Felix and Lucy ended up living a good long life, and I hope you'll read the book for details. They ended up moving to the Midwest. Felix was a pediatrician. He served generations of families. They had 2 children and a big group of grandchildren. And Felix died in an armchair watching a hockey game. And when he died in his early 90s, Lucy turned to her son and said, "I'm not going to survive 6 more months without him." And if you think about it, it made sense, because the only person that remembered the sounds of the way Lucy's father spoke was Felix. And the only person that remembered Felix's sister was Lucy. And so all they had of the past was each other and these shared memories. And so, true to her word, Lucy died 6 months later on what would have been their 75th wedding anniversary in the Warsaw Ghetto. But they left behind this incredible legacy of family that honor them to this day. And I'll leave you with this. This is what Travniki looks like today. This school for mass murder was built on the site of an abandoned sugar factory with a huge smoke tower in the back. And you would never know what went on there. You would never know. There's this little memorial in the corner, but other than that, there's not much to let anyone who walks the grounds know what it was, which was a school for mass murder for 5,000 men, including at least 16 who ended up coming to the United States and hiding in plain sight until this Nazi hunting unit in the Justice Department tracked them down and did their absolute best to bring them to justice. So that's just a little bit about a Citizen 865, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much. We have a lot of questions coming in the Q&A. Keep them coming. If you want a copy of the book, in the chat is a link to a signed copy through Reeds and Company. Our first question is from Nancy. Did the OSI ever look at any of the Nazi scientists and intelligence assets brought into the country, and were they cleared by OSS, CIA, NSA?
Such a good question, and I'm asked it every time I speak. So Nancy's referring to an Operation Paperclip. For those of you who don't know, the CIA recruited a lot of top Nazi scientists to come to the United States. And they did that, and it was incredibly controversial, you all can imagine, but they did that because they didn't want these men to fall into the hands of the Soviets. And after the end of World War II, the Cold War was, raging. And so the Soviets were public enemy number one. And so they recruited them here. I have no idea, and I've asked before how many. It's been reported thousands, it's been reported hundreds. I don't know how many. But the OSI was looking more for other people. A lot of the top Nazi commanders and others, you hear these stories of capture in South America and others. The people who ended up in the Midwest, in the US, were mostly mid-level people. They were the Travniki men. They were, mid-level people in the Third Reich. They weren't the big names that we hear about. But I quoted at the beginning of this book George Will, the conservative commentator, because he wrote this incredible column on the Travniki men, calling them cogs in a wheel, and every cog in the wheel needed to be brought to justice.
Thank you. Sue says, excellent talk. Thank you. Where did these stateless men live in the United States until they died? Jail?
They did not, because remember, they weren't tried in a criminal court. They were tried in civil court. So once they were stripped of their citizenship, OSI took them to an immigration court to see if they could be ordered deported. As I said, tragically, what happened is once they're ordered deported, we have to find another country willing to take them, and that wasn't always possible. So a lot of these men died, stateless men living, essentially in freedom here in the United States. In fact, in 2018, just 2 years ago, a Travniki man from Queens, New York, living in this little row house. I visited him in Queens, New York. I walked into his kitchen. His wife invited me in. In Queens, New York, he had been there for 50 years. He was a Travniki man who served, in the Warsaw Ghetto and in other places. And he had been ordered removed from U.S. soil 14 years before that, but no country would take him back. Finally, in 2018, Germany said they'd take him back. And so the federal government flew him to Germany. He was 95 years old. He died a few months later. But no jail for these men. It was all civil proceedings.
That kind of leans into our next question. Why do you think there was such a resistance from Germany and other countries to take back the war criminals?
No, that's such a good question. And I've often asked Eli Rosenbaum and others at OSI, I don't know if it was just they don't want to deal with it anymore. They felt like they had done enough to bring people to justice. There wasn't much of an appetite for it among the German citizens. They just, for in case after case said no. And in fact, even people that they did accept back went on to live their lives. They weren't brought up on charges in many cases there in Germany. They went on to live their lives. But I think for the people inside this unit, the fact that they were removed from U.S. soil and stripped of their citizenship, that's all they could do under our Constitution, under the law. And that had to be enough. And it was. An exception to that, one of the exceptions was a man named John Demjanjuk. And for those of you who kind of follow this subject might have heard the name. And John Demjanjuk was perhaps the most notorious defendant of this unit. He worked for Ford Motor Company in Cleveland, Ohio, and they thought he was a man named Ivan the Terrible. And it turned out he wasn't Ivan the Terrible, but he was a Travniki man. Travniki was his home base. It was where he was armed and empowered, and it was where he was assigned his missions. And he was, in fact, a death camp guard at the Sobibor extermination center in occupied Poland. And so after many years of legal, trials and it was just round and round in both our legal system and in Israel, Germany did take him back and they tried him for war crimes. And he was convicted of having a hand in murdering thousands of Jews in occupied Poland. He died while the case was on appeal, which meant under German law that he died without a conviction, without being convicted.
I was actually going to bring that up. Many people may have seen the Netflix series. I think it was last year, The Devil Next Door, which kind of goes into this, and some of the characters in that you will find in this book. So kind of interesting to, tie that together.
Yeah. And John Demjanjuk's case was interesting because so many of these men, their kids and their wives didn't defend them. I don't even know if they told their families who they were during the war, but in the Demjanjuk case, his son and son-in-law were huge advocates and still are to this day to try to clear his name.
Yeah, for sure. Lindsay has a question. Do you think there are other war criminals from more recent wars and genocides that are residing in the United States?
Great question, and I'll answer it two ways. One, do you know this unit just found right before the pandemic another Nazi war criminal in the United States in 2019. Could you imagine? It was a man living in Tennessee, of all places. And they dealt with him. But a couple of years ago, the Office of Special Investigations merged inside the Justice Department with another unit that had a broader mission. And their mission is to search for war criminals from other hotspots around the world, like Bosnia and Guatemala and other places. And so their unit now is a post-World War II mission, same concept. The United States should not provide a peaceful life or refuge for war criminals.
Thank you. Did any of the Chervinsky men ever acknowledge their horrendous deeds and perhaps ask for forgiveness?
Wow, also a good question. I think I'll answer it like this. Jacob Reimer, Citizen 865, that's the photos I showed you, was brought in for questioning. By the way, they found Jacob Reimer living a quiet retirement along the shoreline of Lake Carmel in New York. He had a wife and 2 sons, and he read the Bible, and he was really living this quiet life. He had made a living as a Wise potato chip franchise owner in New York. Never saw the inside of a courtroom. Very affable man, looked like a babysitter, looked like someone you could just have a cup of coffee with. And he was brought in for questioning because his name was found on that Nazi roster in Prague in 1990. And so they knew that something was up with Jacob Reimer. And under questioning, he admitted, nobody knew he had done this, he admitted to shooting at a man during a shooting operation in the woods near Travniki. And he was a Travniki leader. He had his own platoon. And what he said to prosecutors was that men, women, and children were brought in by the truckload, lined up against the edge of a ditch, shot by a firing squad. Their bodies fell into a trench. The next crew came in, on and on and on it went. And he said one of the men fell into the ditch, hadn't been killed, and so he was pointing to his head, like, please shoot me, like begging for mercy, put me out of my misery. And Jacob Reimer admitted to shooting at this man, and he said, if I didn't do it, I would have been the next one shot, because the SS would have considered me disloyal and shot me next. So like so many Nazi perpetrators and collaborators, if I didn't do it, I would have been killed. I was a young man. What was I supposed to do at the time? And in court, the prosecutors were able to show, well, hold on a minute. Jacob Reimer was so loyal to the Travniki cause that he was given paid vacations. He was actually able to, during the war, go home, visit his sister who lived in Ukraine, come back unescorted, came back every time. Some men deserted the unit. They wanted no part of it. Jacob Reimer received 4 service medals, paid vacations, and received citizenship in Nazi Germany in 1944, which meant that after the war, he would go back to Germany and settle into this Nazi utopia as a decorated war criminal. So this issue of I didn't have any choice really didn't apply to Reimer and his comrades. There's always choice.
Absolutely. Did the OSI receive any backlash from lawmakers or even citizens who said, okay, this is why we need to have a strong anti-refugee policy? Here we are, the Americans, we let these war criminals in. We can't make that same mistake again. So we need to have a zero tolerance policy.
Yeah, no, I don't think so. That's the first time I've been asked that question, and it's a good one. No, I mean, OSI really tried to stay out of the political fray as much as they could. You know, Congress did in the 1950s let in a number of refugees, but not as many as some would have hoped, right? There were a lot of Holocaust survivors who couldn't get into the United States. And so, they didn't necessarily have a great vetting system at the time. That's how some of these men got in. But at the same time, there wasn't enough about Travniki in particular to know who these men were. In fact, Jacob Reimer acknowledged under questioning when he applied for his visa that he had spent some time during the war in Travniki. But Army intelligence had no idea what Travniki was. In fact, there's no textbooks on Travnicki. For me to tell the story, I had to go to the historians, Peter Black and Barry White, and interview them over and over again to get these details. It's really been, it's just recent understanding of what this unit was. Um, One last thing on that point, the Soviets knew what Travnicki was. They had access to all the records, and in the years after the war, they brought these Travnicki men up on criminal charges because so many of them were Soviet soldiers, and they brought them up for deserting the motherland and fighting for the enemy and put them in prison. But we didn't know that that was happening in the United States because we were in the throes of a Cold War. And so it was only after the communism collapsed and we were able to go look at records that we realized just what Travnicki was, in part because the Soviet records were made available.
Yeah, that's amazing. Can you talk a little bit more about how the OSI works in conjunction and in partnership with historians?
Yeah.
This was, at least it was founded before the Holocaust Museum was in existence, but once the Holocaust Museum, a lot of these people ended up switching, moving there. But I found that so interesting in the book that there was such a harmony between these legal minds, but also they needed the historians to really understand what was happening.
Thank you for asking that question too, because for me as a journalist, you know, the prosecutors are wonderful and heroic in their own right, and they're prosecutors, so they're dynamic and they tell great stories. And I was always interested in the historians, who are hunched over dusty records and wrinkled pants, and because I'm an investigative reporter and I love the idea of finding documents that I didn't know existed. And so to your point, when this unit was first created, it was all about the prosecutors and about investigators from other parts of the federal government, like gun and badge men, people who knew, there was an investigator from the IRS that was pulled into this unit. There was an investigator from Fish and Wildlife that was pulled in. They didn't know anything about the war. If it weren't for the historians that were brought in very early on who could help piece together the history, and put history in context and help detect lies in stories that were told by OSI defendants, I don't know how successful this unit could have been and would have been. And there goes my technology, but I learned in doing this story, in telling this story, that it's not enough to know what happened between 1939 and 1945, right? You have to put that in context. You have to know what happened years before and years after. And that's where the historians came in. I really saw them as the heroes of this story.
Yeah, I agree. I think they played such a vital role. Um, Lindsay has a question. Do you think there are other records pertaining to the Holocaust that will come to light as more years pass?
Yes, and in fact, they just did. Right before the pandemic, in fact, I wrote a story about it for the Washington Post. A deputy commandant of the Sobibor death camp in occupied Poland, who was killed during the famed Jewish uprising in Sobibor, quite a story, um, had stashed, like, for a trophy album of sorts, pictures of himself patrolling the grounds on horseback, and he thought he was just this big shot. Had taken all these pictures and had stashed them in the cupboards of his family home. And then he was killed in the uprising. And only in recent years did this man's grandfather find those photos and turn them over to German historians, who have turned them over since then to the Holocaust Museum here in DC. And those photos, in fact, I have some of them if anyone wants to see, but those photos are among the very first photos of the Sobibor death camp in the historic record. And it's fascinating because you get to see what life was like inside the camp for the young Germans who are eating and having parties on fine china that they probably stole from their Jewish victims, with the gas chambers, just behind them. It's unbelievable. And those photos we didn't know about, and that just came to light. So who knows what this next generation may find, in Europe. Grandchildren and great grandchildren, and might turn over. It'll be interesting to see.
Yeah, for sure. I do remember when that was announced. That was fascinating for sure.
Yeah, because
Um,
the Germans bulldozed these camps to hide evidence of mass murders. They planted flowers and gardens, and so to have those photos now in the record is a pretty big deal.
yeah, absolutely. Do you think we've hit the point where there are no more ex-Nazis alive?
I don't know that anyone really knows. I would suspect the case in Tennessee last year is the last one in the United States, but I have no idea. I mean, they would have to be doing the math very, very old.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. I think those are all the questions that we have. I know someone had just asked me for a link to the book, so I just put it back in the chat again. It's Citizen 865. Debbie, thank you so much for joining
My
us tonight.
pleasure.
It was a fascinating conversation. Thank you everyone for joining us. I'll send a link to the recording as well as the link to purchase the book after tonight's event. So thank you everyone and have a great night.
Take care. Stay healthy.
You too.
Bye.